Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for another in a series of scholarly discussions in celebration of the 150th anniversary of Loyola University Chicago. I am Norberto Grivas, and I had the honor to serve as Provost and Chief Academic Officer for our university and its mission of education, inquiry, and service. We can think of no better way to mark our sesquicentennial than to bring our accomplished faculty together with the community in conversation about their scholarly work. In doing so, we foster informed conversations around some of the most urgent and compelling issues faced by humanity today. In this series, we have discussed racial justice, climate change, colonialism and racism, healthcare disparity, and ways to address poverty and injustice in many forms. These are all complex challenges. In the spirit of the Jesuit mission of our university, we look closely and courageously to discern ways to understand, to heal, to deepen our understanding and achieve greater justice. The presentation today goes right at the complexities of race, ethnicity, colonialism, and the shifting narratives of history. This presentation will strike at the heart of the already heated debate surrounding the role of public monuments in the commemoration and interpretation of history. The presentation seeks to contextualize the history of the Columbus monuments and will compare and contrast views on American identity and diversity as espoused in the 1890s with our current understandings. What symbolic meaning was attached to Columbus then, and to what end? How can we reconcile the symbolism of the past with contemporary multicultural perspectives? We understand that conversations like these can be fraught with controversy and historical trauma. We all know, or many of us know, that Columbus' history was far from heroic, noble explorer that is portrayed in some history books. He was a deeply flawed man who, as short-lived governor of the island of Hispaniola, ordered the enslavement and savage acts of slaughter, torture, and sexual violence against the peaceful Taino people. But, and we'll learn this today, you may be surprised to hear that the myth of Columbus as a hero also emerged because of discrimination. Masses of Italian immigrants who began arriving in America in the late 1800s were poor farmers escaping starvation in southern Italy. They had dark complexions and many spoke little English, and they were frequently stereotyped as simple-minded criminals. And the press stoked fears that the southern Italians were members of the Sicilian mafia. Anti-Italian discrimination ended up engendering brutal acts of violence. Columbus then became a symbol for those immigrants who put his face and helped them feel as a powerful symbol of their own Americanness. So Columbus has had a deep connection to discrimination in the Americas on complex multiple dimensions. But as a university, we must not shy away from the context and complexities. In fearlessly interrogating the past, we can help shine a light on the way forward. In seeking to illuminate difficult issues, our scholars embody how we live our mission today. So now I'd like to introduce the Loyola scholar for the presentation today. Carla Simonini is one of the leading academic voices in Italian American studies in our generation. She is the Paul and Ann Rubino Endowed Professor in Italian American Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at Loyola University Chicago. As a member of our faculty and as inaugural director of our Italian American Studies program, Dr. Simonini has built one of the premier programs of its kind in the country. Dr. Simonini has presented and published numerous works and articles on Italian American identity, Italian American literature, and Italian women writers. Our program tonight is as follows. Professor Simonini will first present for about 45 minutes. I will then serve as a moderator to pose questions submitted either in advance or through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you can submit questions during or after her presentation. So now, without further ado, I welcome Professor Carla Simonini.
Thank you very much. I want to say, first of all, thank you to Provost Grievitz for that wonderful introduction, very generous introduction. I want to thank the administration for including me in this series, and my chair and my deans and everybody who has been so supportive to me since I've been here at Loyola. I'm just finishing up my third year, and I still can't believe how lucky and fortunate I am to have been chosen for this position. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen and go over my presentation, and then I'm looking forward to taking questions after I'm done. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay. So I believe my title has ended up being quite provocative. Christopher Columbus, should he stay or should he go? And really what I'm looking at is the legacy of the world's Columbian Exposition of 1893 and multicultural Chicago today. And, you know, as Provost Grievitz indicated, we certainly have a controversial figure in Columbus, especially in our recent times. So I don't need to give any explanation for these images that I'm sharing with the people of Chicago. These are the sites of protestation after the George Floyd unfortunate, horrible death, and the protests that followed there. So these are the sites of two of the Columbus monuments in Chicago, one in Grant Park and one in Arrigo Park. And they became sites of violent conflict. And as a result, Mayor Lightfoot elected to have the statues removed from the park. So this is some news footage here when the statues were removed from Grant Park and Arrigo Park. And Mayor Lightfoot was quoted as saying, "We took this step in response to demonstrations that became unsafe for both protesters and police, and to efforts by individuals to independently pull the Grant Park statue down in an extremely dangerous manner. This step is an effort to protect public safety and to preserve a safe space for an inclusive and democratic public dialogue about our city's symbols." So the Columbus monuments had become contested and even dangerous spaces in Chicago. So the first two that came down again were Grant and Arrigo Park, and then a week later, a third Columbus statue, which was located in the south side, the Drake Fountain Columbus statue, was also removed. In the wake of the statues coming down, Arrigo Park became something of a ground zero for a grassroots organization of people who were protesting the removal of the statue. There were people that met there on a regular basis. I know there was one man who was bringing coffee and donuts on Sundays. There were speeches held there. A cardboard cutout of Columbus was placed on the where the monument once stood. And it became, the Italian American community became associated with this pro-Columbus grassroots movement, and the JCCIA, the Joint Civic Committee of Italian Americans, became the spokes organization for that group. I'd like to point out first and foremost, though, although they were obviously very visible, very vocal, and very present, this wasn't a uniform response on the part of the Italian American community. There were dissenting voices. First Ward Alderman Daniel Espada, a Democratic Socialist of America, he spoke out in favor of the continued removal of the statues. Also, Gabriel Piedmont, founder of an organization known as the Italian American Heritage Society of Chicago, his organization also spoke out on behalf of seeing these statues eliminated because of what Columbus represents in terms of the horrendous effects of his journey wreaked on indigenous populations. So there were dissenting voices. This was not necessarily a uniformed, monolithic group of voices, but still the one that got the most press was certainly the Italian Americans being associated with the pro-Columbus side of events. One thing I noticed right away is that there was a tendency on the part of Italian American organizations to look for justification for Columbus, to seek out scholars that could help them perhaps put Columbus into a more positive perspective. I call this the Zinn versus Delaney. Carol Delaney is a scholar. She has degrees in religious studies, a PhD in cultural anthropology, and she wrote a very interesting work. It's Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem, in which she posits that Columbus not only sought the Indies as a means to bring great wealth to Spain and to conquer and do it all, but also because he was primarily interested in financing another crusade to take Jerusalem back from the Muslim hands, that he was an apocalyptic thinker of his time, and this was his primary motivation. I think her work is very interesting, and I'll have a lot more to say about it later. But what I noticed was that Carol Delaney was very much in demand, and she was a speaker that spoke on behalf of the NIAF, the National Italian American Foundation, and also our own JCCIA brought her in as a speaker. And to me, this represents sort of a confirmation bias because she had a more favorable view of Columbus in his historical context, that she was sort of the go-to scholar. And I didn't think that that was, if we're really looking for a better and deeper understanding, we need to look at things from a multiplicity of perspectives and not just, seek out the one that is most comfortable for us. So I like to call this the beginnings of my adventures as an accidental Columbus scholar. I had read quite a bit before, but I kept reading, and I tried to look for as many diverse sources, primary sources that were available in translation, scholars of Columbus in the United States and in other countries, and just tried to learn as much as I could. Going through all this, though, I really thought the greater matter was the Italian American community's response to it in the United States. And this was more my area of expertise. So that is where I chose to focus most of my attentions. And that's going to be the focus of this presentation today. So I have up here on the screen, this is a popular Italian saying for the day. In Italian, it says, "Maledetto Cristoforo Colombo e quando ha scoperto l'America." Damn Christopher Columbus and his discovery of America. So this is actually also used by two colleagues of mine, Laura Roberto and Joseph Sciorra, in one of their works. They open up one of their articles with this quote. And this is the lament that was heard about the Italian immigrants during a period when they first arrived and were trying to make sense of their place in this strange world that they had entered into. So I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the conditions that led to the mass migration here. Up on the right-hand corner of the screen there, you see a map of post-Risorgimento, or pre-Risorgimento Italy, I should say. So Italy didn't become a nation, a united nation, until 1861. Prior to that time, it was divided up into many different city-states, different regions. Many foreign powers were in control: the French, the Spanish, the Austrians, the Papal States. And the Risorgimento was ostensibly to bring unity, to create a unified nation out of the Italian continent, a unification that it hadn't seen since dating back to Roman times. And it was accomplished in 1861. Think of how late that date is. 1861 is when the United States was engaged in the Civil War. Italy was just forming as a modern nation. And a big part of this happened when Garibaldi, the great general, he liberated southern Italy, which had been in Bourbon hands under the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and handed it over to King Victor Emmanuel II. And he was a populist. He really believed that he was creating greater opportunity for the peasant classes that were there, and that a united Italy would be a better place, a place of greater freedom, a place of greater rights, of greater economic prosperity, and so on. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. In fact, for a variety of reasons, things actually seemed to get much worse in the South. It had to do with taxation. It had to do with disparities between the agricultural systems, the levels of industrialization, the levels of infrastructure available. And as a result, peasants found themselves and laborers living worse and worse, and emigration became a means of survival. It became sort of a safety valve. So I have here in the quote here, peasants and laborers left villages, hill towns, and farms for the port cities of southern Italy and Sicily, not knowing if they would ever see the families they left behind. They used what little money they had to buy passage on the ships heading across the Atlantic. And between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians left Sicily and southern Italy and entered the United States. Some of these pictures I have here on the screen are of the conditions they found there. On top of there were problems. There were also natural disasters. There were droughts. There was widespread malaria. There were earthquakes. There were all sorts of things that happened, and the conditions were quite poor. So you see on the left a contadini family, a peasant family in Calabria. On the right-hand side, instead, you see laborers in the Sicilian sulfur mines. You can see one of the men is actually naked. It was the conditions were so horrendous that they actually oftentimes worked completely naked in those. And there were young boys that worked there in conditions of near slavery. So these are the conditions they were leaving. And to give you another perspective on that, Booker T. Washington, the famous African-American, had traveled to Sicily in 1912 and was so appalled by the conditions there, he thought that the Sicilians actually lived worse. The agricultural Sicilians lived worse than the African-Americans in the American South during that same time period. So this was the land that the Italians left. I wanted to start with a look at Columbus Day, the history of Columbus Day. And one of the scholars whose research I'm relying on here is Dr. William Connell he's the Lamata Chair in Italian Studies at Seton Hall University. He also has written and contributed many articles to Italian American Studies. Several of them I have referenced at the bottom of the screen. And we talked to him about the history of Columbus Day in the United States. One thing it's important to note that Columbus Day was never officially designated as a holiday that honored Italian Americans. But the history of the holiday, particularly as it relates to Chicago and the Columbian Exposition of 1893, dovetails this involvement with Italians from a very early time period. So Professor Connell talks a lot about the civic or secular nature of holidays in the United States, that ours was a new nation that didn't rely on religious holidays as they had in many places in Europe and still do in many places in Europe, but the holiday system was set up along civic guidelines, things that made you a good citizen, things that people could come together to represent their Americanness. And Columbus Day was one of them. The first National Columbus Day, which was recognized as a one-time event, was in 1892. And again, the Columbia World Exposition was in celebration of that event. It took a year to get in place. That's why it didn't take place till 1893, although it was declared in 1892. And Professor Connell talks about how this was declared by President Benjamin Harrison. And he has linked it to two events which he feels that President Harrison was very troubled by. One of them was the 1891 lynchings of 11 Italians in New Orleans. So in 1891, there was a large Sicilian population that worked and lived along the docks in New Orleans. There was resentment towards them. They stayed together in a group. They had taken over some of the industry that surrounded the import of fruits and vegetables along the port. Another thing is they fraternized and interacted very freely with other African Americans, which was not looked kindly upon by the mainstream folks down there in New Orleans, and they were considered to be warring factions. There were two groups of families there that were trying to get control of the docks, and there seemed to have been other competing industry or interests there amongst the mayor and other town folks there. The long story short is the police chief was executed. He was shot down in the middle of the day, and allegedly his dying words were, "The Dagos got me." So this, of course, led to a bit of hysteria. The police were sent into the Italian neighborhood, and they rounded up people in sort of a haphazardous fashion without telling them why they were being arrested. They threw a whole bunch of them in jail, and eventually 9 of them were put on trial, and most of them were acquitted, and a few of them was a mistrial. This was the outcome of them. And you got to imagine in this climate, which was highly prejudiced against the Italians, for them to have the jury to have not found sufficient evidence against them was a rather amazing thing. It had to have been quite stark, the lack of evidence against them. Interestingly enough, the judge, rather than releasing them, as they probably should have been once they had a not guilty or a hung jury verdict, they sent them back to the prison and they were locked up again. There was, interestingly, the response of the outstanding citizens of the town was to first of all, someone put a notice in the paper saying that they had to do something about this miscarriage of justice. There was a meeting arranged at the center of the town at a clay statue, a clay monument in the middle of town. Thousands of people showed up for this. The crowd was whipped up into a frenzy. Again, we're talking about the ruling elite of the town, businessmen, lawyers, other professionals. They actually broke down into regiments that were in militaristic style, and they marched on the prison, where not only the 9 people who had been either acquitted or found of a hung trial were still being held, but a whole bunch of the other Italians who had been rounded up were also being held in that prison cell as well. At some point, the jailer opened the doors to the jail and told the Italians that were being held there, "Run, get out of here," but the crowd descended upon them. 9 people were shot dead. 1 young boy, the age of 14, hid and was able to get away, but he watched his father being shot. 2 others were dragged out, hung up, and hung till they were dead, also shot shot at while they were hanging, and their clothes were stripped off them, and all sorts of things were done. The Italian consul to the city had tried to intervene. He had seen the danger, and this actually precipitated a breach in U.S.-Italian diplomatic relations over this. The coverage in the mainstream U.S. press was on the side of the crowd. Mainstream newspapers like the New York Times and other widely read and respected publications said that they thought the crowd had done a rather good thing, and it was that those guys got what they deserved, and it was all in all, it was a good thing that happened. So that was one of the incidents that Benjamin Harris apparently had some remorse about, because he went against Congress and did issue $25,000 in remuneration to the victims' families of those Italians that were lynched in New Orleans. The other incident that that Connell says that Harris was concerned about was the massacre at Wounded Knee, which was, the last stand. It was a massive slaughter of the Sioux Lakota. 300 were killed. Horrible incident that happened there. Although the soldiers that were involved in it were given medals of honor, it was, Connell holds that Harris felt that this was really a botched attempt to disarm the camp, and he had some remorse over this as well. So Connell postulates this as the backdrop to why Harrison decided to name this holiday, and it was about healing, according to Professor Connell, healing in, again, 1893 terms, and it was about Americanization, again, in 1983 terms. I have to keep stressing that. This is a turning point in U.S. history. We suddenly have the closing of the frontier. There's no more wide open land happening there. There's an influx of new people coming to the United States who look different, these Southern and Eastern Europeans that were coming in. So it's a period of change. And so there's a moment when Harrison wants to reaffirm what it means to be American and brings these people together. He uses the figure of Columbus to do it because Columbia was another word for American. Columbus as an adjective or as a place name became Columbia. All the places in the United States, Columbia University, all the cities and places that are named Columbia refer to this place name, which is a meaning of American that comes from Columbian. And that's what it meant. When they said the world's Columbian Exposition, it meant the American Exposition there. And again, it was part of a civic, secular holiday system that people were celebrating then. And people were brought together. One of the troubling parts of this, I mean, the Italians participated in this. There was a chance for them to prove that they were good Americans by participating in it. There were also representatives there from the various American Indian tribes as well. And again, American in that time period meant to assimilate. So to show your Americanness was to show how you had largely been successful in letting go of those things that were considered non-conforming to the American ideal. And that was a large part of what happened during that time period then. It was a one-time event, I have to stress that. So it was a singular, one-time national holiday to promote healing and Americanness in terms of diversity being assimilated into what it meant to be one people at that time period. So I asked Professor Connell, there also were parades held along with this in New York City, and the same thing. There was mass participation. That wasn't just the Italians, but there were school children that came with this. There were representatives from the Indian boarding schools, which have a horrible history. Again, the reason behind the Indian schools was to remove any trace of Indian heritage from those young people. But at the time, the thought was that this was us coming together as a nation. And I, talked also about different aspects of Columbus Day and interactions with, Italians between Native Americans hadn't been something that happened in the American frontier. So it's interesting that, this juxtaposition is coming up now in our contemporary times. One thing that both Professor Connell and another conversation I had with Heather Miller, who is a former executive director of the American Indian Council of Chicago, I talked to them about the National Day of Mourning, which is something I remember when I was growing up in Providence, Rhode Island. This was a time when Native American rights movement was coming to the forefront. It was about 1970. And that's what I remember being the focus in terms of the push for recognition of atrocities committed against Native Americans and rethinking an American holiday and from a different perspective. And I would talk to Heather about that. And her point was that we need to look at addressing these forms of genocide everywhere that it occurs. And certainly there still is the National Day of Mourning that takes place on the same day as Thanksgiving, that continues to be recognized at Plymouth plantations in Massachusetts, and that Indigenous Peoples Day is a broadening up of that. And I think also, this is me inserting here too, I think with our greater number of immigrants that we're seeing from Central and South America, who their history has a more direct connection. We know that Columbus never actually set foot in North America, but so there's a more direct connection with his landing in Hispaniola and what happened with the colonization across South and Central America. And I think, there's this broadening of perspective that has come about as a result of that. And it's interesting that several countries in South America have change the name of Columbus Day. In Venezuela, it's called Dia de la Resistencia Indígena, the Day of Indigenous Resistance. In Argentina, it's the Day of Respect for Cultural Diversity. And in Bolivia, it's Decolonization Day. So there's been a movement in those countries, you know, away from Columbus Day, and recognition of what happened to the indigenous peoples there. So again, and one other thing I wanted that Professor Connell pointed out is that one thing that's unusual about Columbus Day as opposed to any other holiday, yes, it's named for an individual, for Christopher Columbus, but the celebration was ostensibly about the landing, the moment, you know, that there's this it's a moment in time that there are very few dates in history which one can point to in which the world as we know it was irrevocably changed. And certainly October 12th, 1492 is one of those dates. So that was my conversation and my research doing with Professor Connell. Here are two other Italian-American scholars, Laura Roberto and Joseph Sciorra, who I mentioned before, and they have an interesting take on that. They have published quite a bit on Christopher Columbus and the Italian-American community's engagement with his figure. They are scholars of American material culture, and they take a particular interest in public monuments. Up on the top, you see a blog for American history is where they had one of their most recent articles published in tandem with the toppling of the statues that occurred over the summer of 2020. And I'm just going to give you a little overview about where their research comes from. So their research reveals the many ways that many Columbus statues that were erected between the 1890s and the 1930s, and this is a quote from them, they were commissioned, paid for, and built by Italian immigrants, not as in the case of Confederate statues to impose political dominance over others, but on the contrary, as a means to gain entrance into a racist society under the cover of whiteness. And that's a quote from their article in Process History. And Sciorra and Roberto further argue that the fundraising campaigns for Columbus, they originated what they call the prominenti. These were the big shots in the community, the wealthier ones in the community, the ones who were already business owners and had a stake, who had some money behind them. These were the most successful Italian-American business owners. A lot of them hailed from the North, which had a different history from Italy's South. And they viewed the construction of these Columbus monuments as a means to publicly claim full inclusion in American society by linking the civilization of their homeland to the founding mythology of the United States. In establishing their Americanness through Columbus, the Prominenti simultaneously promoted a singular national Italian identity that devalued and inhibited expressions of Italianità as practiced in Southern and working class Italian-American communities, such as religious street festa and the continued use of regional dialects. So Sciorra and Roberto maintain that in New York City, for example, the erection of the Columbus Circle statue in Manhattan in 1892, again erected in conjunction with the first National Columbus Day celebration. It was Generoso Carlo Bassotti who raised the money for it. And he was a newspaper owner. He owned a prominent Italian-American newspaper, Progresso Italo-Americano. And later in 1937, a later owner of that same newspaper, Generoso Pope, also was instrumental in founding the first Columbus Day parade in that city. And, you know, among his other accomplishments, he was very much a pro-fascist, which was not that uncommon in the 1930s, not only amongst, in the United States in general. Mussolini didn't really get villainized until he began his alliance with Hitler. But so in general, Sciorra and Roberto view the Italian-American community's symbolic appropriation Columbus as being rooted in a right-wing political agenda that recognized the attendant privilege of whiteness and promoted assimilation. And they see the 1971 declaration of when Columbus Day finally became a federal holiday in the US as part of the ethnic revival movement. And this is a moment in time where they say that American whiteness shifted from Plymouth Rock whiteness to Ellis Island whiteness. And they're relying on the scholarship of Matthew Fry Jacobson for that viewpoint. So that was their position there. Another interesting scholar of the Italian-American group's involvement with Christopher Columbus is Bénédicte Deschamps. She's a French scholar of Italian-American immigrant history, and she overlaps quite a bit with Sciorra and Ruberti's scholarship. She also did primary research in the newspapers, the Italian language newspapers of different cities across the United States. She confirms much of what Roberto and Sciorra found in the Progresso Italo-Americano about the fundraising that was certainly spearheaded by the most prominent members of the community. However, she notes, that there was widespread contribution to this. People were anxious to be a part of it. And another thing she brings out in her scholarship too is the placement of the monument. The Christopher Columbus Monument in New York City was not erected in one of the Little Italy neighborhoods. It was in Manhattan, and that was on purpose. There was this symbolic placement of him in the middle of the city. And on the Columbus Day celebration, the Italians who had been afraid, had to go out, were encouraged to leave their Little Italy neighborhoods, and they were brought out onto the streets where they didn't normally go, and they were seen in public, and they were given permission to let themselves be known and to be seen publicly. And that was an important thing, the sense of belonging that came along with attaching themselves again to the figure. She also agrees that there was an emphasis on Italian national unity. When I was talking about Italy before the Risorgimento and how it was all divided up, Italians came to this country being very much attached to their regional identity. They didn't know what it was to be an Italian. They had only been Italians for a couple of decades, and that really didn't mean much to them. They were Calabrese, or they were Sicilian, or they were Abruzzese, or even more than that, they were from their individual little town. And in this period, the Prominenti wanted them to become united in Italianness. And again, this is where, some of Mussolini's influence with the fascist party, he was also influential in promoting that dialogue, that there was a oneness of Italian unity. And Benedicte does a wonderful job showing how this was manifest. Even in the menu that they had at some of the celebrations, they made sure that the menu included everything from pesto genovese from the far north to, macaroni and pomodoro from Neapolitan region. So there was this idea that there was a oneness of Italians that was being celebrated, and also their oneness with being part of the American mainstream society as well. And it was assimilationist too. There was an idea of sort of giving up a lot of this. Benedicti points out how part of the articles talked about how the Italians should behave, that they shouldn't act in ways that would draw unflattering attention to themselves, that they shouldn't be the types of people that they had been ridiculed for being or had been discriminated for being. So there was this sense that they had to maintain a certain decorum, that they had to be the right type of Italian, that they could celebrate their Italianness, but do it in a way that was acceptable to mainstream America, and that would have been considered dignified. That was one of the things she looked at with New York. Another thing she looked at was in Denver, Colorado. Denver, Colorado is another interesting case study because the first official Columbus Day, first state holiday for Columbus Day, was celebrated in Denver in 1907. And it was because of an Italian American who, again, was looking for acceptance for his compatriots who were being treated extremely badly at this period in time. His name was Angelo Noce. And he, together with the man named Ciro Mangini, they both happened to be Genovese, which is the city which Christopher Columbus is associated with. And they founded a Christopher Columbus Hall, and it became a place for them to assert their Catholicness also. Christopher Columbus was also closely associated with Catholicism in the United States. And it was a means for them to lobby for better treatment of the immigrants and what was going on at the time there. I'm going to read you a little bit about what the conditions were like at the time. Mother Cabrini, she later became a saint, Saint Frances X. Cabrini. She visited Colorado, and as we know, she has actually spent a good time here in Chicago. And in visiting the Colorado mines, she was appalled by the plight of her countrymen. In the early 1900s, this is what she wrote about that, what was going on there. During my journey, I saw these dear fellows of ours engaged in the construction of railways railways in the most intricate mountain gorges. The hardest labor is reserved for the Italian worker. Few regard him with a sympathetic eye, care for him, or remember that he has a heart and soul. They merely look upon him as the ingenious machine for work. In the Colorado mines, Italians slave away until someday a cave-in, explosion, or accident of some kind cuts their life short, leaving their wives widowed and their children fatherless. They do not even need a grave, having been buried in the tomb in which they spent their whole lives toiling. So this was the situation there. And again, it was embraced by the Italian American community. And here's the flip side to that. The first protesters of a Columbus Day parade also were Italian Americans. And it was at this same Denver parade. And they were anarchists. These were the Italian American anarchists and labor organizers, not just anarchists, but leftists. They were labor organizers. And they felt that it was wrong for the Italians who were, if they were seeking to improve their conditions and be treated with greater dignity in the mines, the way to do it wasn't to affix themselves to an imperialist figure such as Columbus, but they would do better to organize and form unions and protest. However, they seem to have been in the minority, and Benedicte shows that there was widespread support. Unlike Roberto Ischioro, who talks about how this was sort of a prominente top-down, Benedicte says there was a plethora of people who wanted this parade to continue, who felt they found their dignity in it and they found their place in it. So that was an important point that Benedicte brought up. And I want to add a little bit other to this. Angelo Noce, again, he published a newspaper called La Stella, which Benedicte Deschamps did her primary research in. He made it his life's mission to found Columbus Day holidays around the country. When he died in 1922, there were 35 states that had a Columbus Day celebration, and he attached it to both acceptance for Catholics who were not at this point still well accepted in the United States, and for the Italians. In 1920s, the parade had a hiatus because of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan shut it down because they felt they didn't like it being a celebration of foreignness. They didn't like it being a celebration of Italianness, immigrants, Catholicness, all that. So they succeeded in shutting the parade down in Denver. And it had an interesting history. It was on and off for a number of years, and was finally revitalized around the 1990s. And the last time it was protested was in the early 2000s. And here is something interesting that the people of Denver have done. In October 4th, 2020, the Italian American community of Denver got together with the Native American community there, and they together reached an agreement about replacing what had been Columbus Day and the parade with a Mother Cabrini parade, a Mother Cabrini Day parade. That began in October of 2020. So Benedicte, in sharing this information, was talking about, look, it's interesting what the conditions were at a point in time, which afforded dignity and respect, and how that can and should change and shift over time. And in fact, the Archdiocese of Denver was involved with the commemoration of that parade on October 4th, 2020. And their statement was, guided by her own love for Jesus, Mother Cabrini had an incredible love for the poor, sick, immigrants, and the less fortunate. And she helped establish 67 schools, hospitals, and orphanages across the country. In Denver, she ministered to Denver's poor Italian immigrants and established schools, convents, orphanages, and a summer camp for girls. So that is the situation in Denver along there. So now I'm circling back to Columbus's own monuments here. We see on the left side the Drake Fountain, which was on the south side. In the middle, we have the Arrigo Park Columbus Monument, and on the right, the Arrigo Park Columbus Monument. All three of these monuments are tied to the World Columbian exhibitions, two to the one in 1893 and one to the 1934. I'm going to start with the two that are tied to, I'm going to start with the Drake Fountain on the left. The Drake Fountain was commissioned by John a Drake of the Drake Hotel fame. It's a bronze statue. It was erected it came in late. It was supposed to be placed at the fairgrounds. The statue came much later, and it provided a fountain. It was supposed to be a watering hole also for the people who had animals or who needed to cool themselves down during the heat of the festival. So that's where that was commissioned and brought there. The Arrigo Park was also commissioned for the 1893 Columbus Day Columbian World Exposition. It was originally at the Italian Pavilion there. It stood there for a while. It was taken to another location and down in Chicago, but it had laid in storage for many years. Part of the problem with what to do with it, there was it needed restoration, and also it wasn't a statue in the round. It didn't have a back on it. It was meant to be placed in an alcove, so it had to have things done to it before it could be placed anywhere. And on the far right, the Grant Park was in for 1934, I'm sorry. And this is interesting because it was an Italian sculptor who erected that. Many Italians were sculptors and did quite a bit of the public monuments that you see all across the United States. The artist was a Carlo Brioschi. And it's interesting because in years later, at the base of it, there are four figures, four heads, and they were supposed to be Vespucci, Toscanini, Columbus, and the fourth one was accused of being a bust of Mussolini. And Amerigo, his son, interesting that this Carlo Brioschi named his son Amerigo, which means America. He protested bitterly, saying, oh, his father didn't mean for it to be Mussolini. But I'm saying, given the time period in which it was erected and the influence that Mussolini had in trying to instill this sense of Italianness, it very well could have been. He tried to say it meant the glories of Rome, but it's hard to make a case that it didn't look like Mussolini. So that was Grant Park. And I want to come back to the Arrigo Park one, because this is the one that has become the site of that grassroots movement I was talking to you about. So as I said, it was in the Italian Pavilion at the World's Columbian Expo. And it was there for a while. It sat in storage up until 1965 after it lost a home that it was in downtown Chicago. And then it was State Representative Victor Arrigo who started the fundraising campaign to bring the statue, to give the statue a permanent home. And he was a lawyer. He spearheaded the campaign. But again, like so many of the other campaigns that I told you about in New York and other places, it may have been someone who was a prominente in the community who spearheaded the campaign, but many people of very modest means gave money to support it and wanted, saw it as a source of pride. They wanted to see it come to their community. And it wasn't just any community. In 1965, they were bringing it to what they saw as the revitalized Little Italy community. And there's a whole history behind what happened in Taylor Street. My own associate dean, Art Lariggio, has been interviewed for WBEZ about this. Where the University of Illinois Chicago now stands is on what had been much of the Taylor Street Little Italy community. And there still is, to this day, a lasting sense of betrayal and resentment on the part of former Mayor Richard J. Daley on having cut the deal which allowed that UIC to have been constructed over what had been their community, especially after that community had provided him with a lot of political support through his last mayoral campaign. And it went down. There's different sides to this, as there are to any debate, but the sense of betrayal felt by the community was very real, and they took it very personally. And one of the women who organized to try to stop the destruction of the Taylor Street Little Italy was a woman named by the name of Florence Scala. And this fight was taken on. It was an example of an Italian-American community coming together successfully to organize civically and to protest. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court refused to hear their appeal. And at that point, the wrecking balls came in and destroyed a large swath of what had been the Little Italy neighborhood. And there was also a sense of betrayal because part of the revitalization had been predicated on first declaring it a slum. And this was a political strategy. If you declared it a slum, you were eligible for federal dollars or grant money to come in so you could rebuild their community. So that same slum designation was then used as justification for the demolition that led to UIC being constructed. So there was sort of like this double betrayal that here we did this because we were promised that this was going to be our new home, we were going to recreate it anew, and instead it's become the excuse to tear it down. So having that statue in that community at that period of time was saying we've arrived, we belong. This is our home. This is a space that we feel we can call ours. So I'm going to go on. Actually, I'm going to go back a little bit to Arrigo Park. I want to say this, that I've heard disparagements cast upon some of the Italian Americans in the Arrigo Park. To call them, that their support for Columbus is because they're either they're racist or that they're willfully ignorant. I think it's harsh. There's a historiography of Columbus that is hard to let go of, which is not to say that it can't develop and change, but there's some reason for the strong attachment, in particular with that one monument. So my final thing here, I'm looking at Fred Gardefeu, who is another distinguished professor of Italian American Studies. He wrote about Beyond Columbus. He noticed how, he talked about the removal of the statues, and he compared it to Mayor Lightfoot taking away a toy from two warring parties over it. And he's nudging, his whole message was, maybe this should be a wake-up call for Italian Americans or Italian Americans of Italian descent. What does it really mean to be Italian American? Why is there so much vested in Columbus? Is our sense of self, is our sense of an ethnic community so fragile that without Columbus, we don't have anything to build upon? And he notes how much has been lost for assimilation, and very few Italian Americans still speak the language. A lot of us don't have information beyond our grandparents. A lot of us can't trace much of the history back to the early roots of the immigrants, and many know more about high Italian society than they do about the more humble origins from which more of the immigrants come from. And I think that was part of the reason why my position was funded, was Dominic Candeloro's slogan was preserving a future for our past, so that history is available and should be looked at and examined, and in light of what we have, what it means to be Italian American, again, thinking beyond Columbus. So this was an interesting event I wanted to mention. This happened back on March 14th, 1891. The JCCIA, under the presidentship of Ron Onesti, organized a 130th anniversary of the New Orleans mass lynching. That's the lynching I talked about at the beginning of the presentation here, the 11 Italians, Sicilians specifically, who were lynched on that. And I think it was, let's think about what we mean by a lynching. So a lynching is a form of violence in which a mob, under the pretext of administering justice without trials, executes a presumed offender, often after inflicting torture and corporal mutilation. And in the United States, of course, it's a form of a racial violence that took place. And the Italians, were subject to the 1891. At that event, they played a piece from a speech that the mayor of New Orleans, Mayor Cantrell, gave when she pardoned. She forgave. She asked for forgiveness. She issued a formal apology to the descendants of these Italians who were lynched in New Orleans. And in her speech, she said she was offering the apology in the spirit of condemning anti-immigrant violence in all forms. One of the guest speakers at that event was Toni Preckwinkle, the Cook County Board President. And I thought she gave a very good presentation there. She talked about, in remembering the 11 Italians that were lynched in 1891, that we should also call to mind at that same event the thousands and thousands and thousands of African Americans who were also lynched, and think about the epithets and the slurs that were thrown at Italian Americans, one of them being WAP, which meant without papers, which in our language today, we would say undocumented. So I would say that there's room for coming together around these issues. I can think that those 11 Sicilians that were lynched, 2 of them had criminal records. Not all of them were American citizens. They were accused of being violent and having gang warfare against them. I mean, these types of things, are not new. We talk also about maybe Sacco and Vanzetti, the 2 who were executed largely because of anti-immigrant discrimination, but also because their political views were radical at the time. So the Italians have a history that connects with very much what's going on in today's climate as well. And I actually did write to Ron Onesti, the president of the JCCIA, asking about, given that this event was celebrated, that there might be room to issue some statements along the lines of Mayor Cantrell's speech, denouncing anti-immigrant violence, such as what's happening, especially with the Asian community, the anti-Asian violence that was happening. And he did answer, he was receptive to that. Still haven't had a follow-up conversation, but that I think is some means in which we can stake our common humanity. So here we are today. Here are the 3 empty pedestals. I am going to end by reading a quote from an article written by Dominic Condoloro, who's adjunct faculty member in the history department here at Loyola, also one of the people who was instrumental in fundraising for my position here. And he wrote this back in 1992. So consideration of Columbus and his image remind us that history depends on focus. Each generation revises the readings of history of previous generations so that the body of history becomes a dialogue between our ancestors' preservation of the information they wish to pass on and ourselves, who often ask different questions and seek information about the issues relevant to our times. So, I am going to end my presentation there, and just on the final note, that Italian American culture has proven to be resilient and adaptable over time. And I think that we need to take a look at, what may have been accepted practices in the past, ask ourselves, how do we feel about them in the present? And who are we as a people? What do we want to learn, not only as human beings, but, in particular with regard to the Columbus monuments here in Chicago as citizens of this pretty amazing city. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you for this interesting presentation. I will proceed with questions. So we got several that came before, several that came now. The questions, I'll start with a preface, are interesting because they show a strong polarization between ways of thinking about Columbus in general and the statues and so on. So I think I'd like to begin with questions related to polarizations and possible alternatives, and I'll try to moderate it in a way that will go on the 2 sides of the pole, so to speak. And so actually, I would like to start with a question that was put in the chat and get your opinion, I think, is what's being asked. This is a question by Theodore Karamansky, and it says, what should the city do with the Grand Park statue? Should the statue be contextualized via text that presents Columbus in the light of Native American history as well as of Italian and Catholic heritage. And it's an interesting beginning point there, and that's the question. I think it's asking for your thoughts on this. How to address it.
I definitely think dialogue absolutely has to take place, and especially the Grand Park one. I mean, that's in a prominent place in the middle of the city, and you have to ask what values are being communicated like that, just like they're going through an evaluation in different places with what values are being communicated by the Confederate monuments there. You know, again, certainly there was a different reason why the Columbus statues were erected, and it was due to discrimination, but that's not to say that it doesn't, that it has a different meaning for other groups, and that needs to be recognized. Whether or not it should stay up or not is not my decision to make, but there absolutely has to be dialogue around that. We have to, we can't have something in a public space that's not given due vetting for all the people that it represents. So we have multicultural Chicago in 2021. That's very different than multicultural Chicago in 1893. And it has to be contextualized. You can't let it stand on just its own merits there. I feel very strongly about that.
Thank you. So a question also of alternative. I think there were two questions that came before this presentation that were sort of asking relations to Columbus. One was, is there a historical hero that could become a new Italian-American symbol of nobility and accomplishment in the new country? Mm-hmm. And a related question, why was Columbus chosen as the great Italian figure to improve Italian-American sentiment when there were better options? So those are related questions specifically about alternatives.
Well, as far as alternatives, I mean, I think in Denver, they certainly have come up with an alternative. They've chosen to embrace Mother Cabrini, and there's a similar movement afoot along those lines in New York City. She did have a statue erected in her honor in New York City. And she's somebody who was directly involved with the Italian immigrant community in a way that Columbus absolutely wasn't. So there's certainly one figure. There's different figures that come over. I mean, there was an Italian signer of the Declaration of Independence, Pacca. There's different figures to choose from. I mean, there's even certainly anybody who's involved with the Age of Discovery like Vespucci or are problematic for other reasons. But, I think I found that very compelling what they did in Denver, and I think that's something to consider.
And how about 1890s?
The 1890s. Well, so, again, Columbus was America at that point. I mean, it was offered. I mean, the Italians weren't coming at it from a position of agency at that point in time where they could choose somebody. Columbus had already been chosen, so they were looking to fit in, from the bottom up. So Columbia was already synonymous with America. I don't know what, I mean, certainly the anarchists had different ideas about things, and the people who were the labor leaders had different ideas about that. But in terms of promoting something that would have gotten them widespread acceptance at that point of time, I'm hard pressed to see whom they would have chosen. So
another question, do you think the monument evaluation process should include a truth and reconciliation moderated discussion?
Yes, very much it should. Very much it should. And, also, I know other people have written to me. I mean, I purposely avoided getting into the history of Columbus and the historiography of Columbus. But that's the place for those types of dialogues. There are numerous, there are volumes that have been written, and looking at different perspectives from different nationalities, from different points of view, from different parts of the political spectrum, and different points in time too, I think is very important, and that should be part of that as well.
So I would like to, as I said, the questions are polarized, and I was going to come with questions from both sides. And at this stage, I'd like to ask you a question from the side opposite to Columbus, and I think it is important to have both voices. Mm-hmm. This comes from Raymond Dye, mm-hmm. And the question is, I have no problem with celebrations of Italian pride and Italian contributions to world culture, of which there are many. But Christopher Columbus's genocide of the Taínos should not be ignored. Let's face it, he was driven by greed, forcing Taínos to deliver quantities of gold or have their hands severed. He also attempted to slave them, perhaps being the father of the transatlantic slave trade. Why not follow in the Denver's footsteps and celebrate Mother Cabrini? What about a monument memorializing the 9 Italian Americans who were murdered by the mobs in New Orleans in 1891? So that's a long question, but
well, I think those are 2 really good suggestions. I guess part of the problem, and I'm going to be like a little bit of a devil's advocate here, is that nobody likes to be told by somebody outside their community who they should hold up as a hero. It's one thing, I think, when you do an internal review of that, it's hard to hear. And I'm not saying that it's not warranted that we should hear different things like that, but human nature, there's a natural resistance, like being told, it's one thing when you punish your own children, but if someone else tells you what your children are doing wrong, there's a certain human nature defensiveness that comes with that. I think those are excellent situations, and I would hope that within the community, those are things that we would certainly talk about. And here's where you get into that area where I avoided it, as far as one of the critiques of Howard Zinn is, he set out to write his people's history. He was very clear that he wanted to show it from a different perspective. He's upfront with that too. And I think one of the reasons that Carol Delaney was so often brought about as the person to speak to the Italian American groups is because she pointed out some of the flaws in that first chapter that he writes out. There are some things where he slashes, he attributes things, he puts it in a chapter headed Columbus when not everything was done by Columbus personally. You could argue that Columbus was in charge and it's still his responsibility as the leader. So these are the types of things that would be amazing to sit down face to face and talk about. One of the things that is hard to hear, I think a lot of people don't like to recognize this who are in favor of Columbus, is that he did send, a whole boat of slaves back to Spain, and 200 of them or so died along the way, and they were thrown out at sea. And then, you could talk about it was accepted in the time. Spain had been enslaved the people in the Canary Islands when they took over that territory, and Portugal had papal authority to enslave, the Africans when they were engaged in their colonial enterprises there. But putting it in that context today we know that that's not something we want to support or believe in. And Delaney talks a lot about Columbus's mission, as a Catholic, that he really was a very pious man who believed that he was going over on a God-sent mission, to help save humanity, to reclaim the world for Christianity and save souls. And it seems by all accounts that he was very sincere in that belief. And then he got into this thing with, a just war versus an unjust war. You could take slaves if they were hostile and whatnot. I don't know that amounts to... It still happened. It still happened. Whether he was operating under what was normative at the time, and whether or not the Pope said it was okay at the time, it happened. It happened. And the results were atrocities and tragedies and genocide. And, it did start with his landing there. And that's something that we need to be able to talk about.
Now I'll take the other side question from a more Italian-American perspective. In the spirit of balancing the questions, because they are really divided in the chat. This comes from Pasquale Gianni, and the question is, couldn't you say that rejecting Columbus is rejecting the hundreds of millions of immigrants that came and contributed to this new world in a meaningful way? Slavery already existed among the tribes here, it's something you mentioned, but so did cannibalism, human sacrifice, which Europeans came to reject. Columbus crossing the Atlantic at the time he did is the most significant and impactful occurrence in the history of humankind. That's from Pasquale Gianni. So.
Well, I guess it depends on how we decide to define ourselves as a community. I mean, again, Columbus never came to North America. He was from Genoa, although there are some people, there's still some dispute about that. Genoa was a city-state at the time, was before Italy even existed. Yes, that date in time, I think William Connell stressed that in his scholarship, it's a rare date in time. And I know there's other, Mike deGrasse Tyson talks about that was a moment in time when the world changed. And quite frankly, most of us would not be here right now had that not happened. So, I mean, but in terms of that, me recognizing Columbus in a perspective in which a man of, I don't know, I don't feel like it's an either or. I don't feel like I'm disrespecting any of my immigrant ancestors by attaching my importance in this country and the contribution of Italian Americans and people of Italian descent. I don't think it needs to be Columbus. I mean, that's the question, why Columbus? There was a reason why it was Columbus, because Columbus was Columbia, was America. But much has happened since then.
Yeah,
it's not to say that there aren't still things that we can admire. I mean, I do think Carol Delaney's book points out a lot of, I mean, I find him to be a very fascinating character. I mean, he was subject to a lot of put downs from his own men for being a foreigner, you know, and, you know, he went through some of the things that I think, you know, Italians identify with, you know, that, well, I'm not going to, who's this foreigner? Who is this guy? You know, he's not noble. He's, you know, from lowly birth. He's so.
So talking about Carol Delaney, I put two questions. They are related. One came today and one came before. The question says, you imply that Carol Delaney is biased. How about Howard Zinn? Was he biased? Have you read Debunking Howard Zinn by Mary Grabar? I hope
Mary
I'm
Grabar, yeah.
Grabar, thank you.
Yeah.
And then another related question, which I will read to you, is how do you feel the article in the Franoi represents the historical facts on Columbus? So if you could address those questions.
Oh boy. Do I think Howard Zinn is biased? Well, yes, and he says up front that he sat out to that enough had been written on you know, history had been written by the conquerors. You know, the rabbit hunter. He outright says I want to rewrite history from the perspective of the rabbit, and I think he felt he was taking a corrective action there, and you know he did. You know, was shed important light on us being able to reconsider ourselves from a different perspective. I don't necessarily think Carol Delaney is biased. I think she is a fine scholar. I find her book very compelling. I think the arguments she lays out are but even Carol Delaney recognizes that he brought over slaves. You know, she frames it in terms of his apocalyptic mission and that his piousness and only trying, and she puts a lot of the blame more on his men. And she's not the only one. Las Casas is another primary source who is often cited quite frequently by Zinn about the atrocities that were committed and the genocide that ensued. And even Las Casas, you know, he tends he is very favorably disposed to Columbus. He sees him as having been, he and Columbus, he puts the two of them at the front of this evangelical mission to convert and bring Christianity to everyone. So he excuses Columbus for things that happened and blames and puts more onus on his men. So there are those interpretations, and they are valid. I don't think that Carol is Professor Delaney is biased. I do think that she was the one that was most often brought out to speak because she framed it in terms of seeing him more in a positive light. So and there was no one ever invited to show him from the opposite perspective. That was my point with her. And as far as the article in Mary Graeber's book, I have read articles by her. And again, I would say this is where, like I do this, with my own students, there's so much information today, like trying to distinguish between an authentic source and what might be not necessarily an authentic source. I think Mary Graeber has an agenda. She is aligned with a conservative group. So that is where you can expect that her opinion is going to fall, and it does. And as for the Fra Noi article, I thought it was extremely good, and especially that it gave a list of all the primary sources that you can avail yourself of that are available in translation. I thought it was very well done. I was a little concerned that one of the sources that that article relied on so heavily was another person, Rafael Ortiz, who's written a number of books, but is self-published, and as far as I know is not a scholar of any sort, but has gone ahead and written his own interpretations based on what he takes away from it. And again, he's clear on where he wants the arguments to end up. So I'm not saying I just think you need to read attentively and carefully and know where no historian is completely unbiased either. I know but read multiple sources and see what they're saying. Look how they line up. I think the Fra Noi article was especially good at the end where they gave references to the primary sources, and you can go back and look at those. I have some of them right here. I've got Las Casas and I've got Samuel Eliot Morrison. I was able to go and look and read the passages. So that would be my answer to that.
I found your answers balanced in the sense that you do think there are alternatives and that we need to have a discussion and conversation. So I want to put to you a question from an Italian American who may think like you. I just want to put the question and get your reaction. This comes from Kate De Carlo Santiago, and she writes as follows: there are Italian Americans that don't want their culture associated with someone who engaged in slavery and brutality. And in parentheses, she puts, I am one of them. If we are applying an anti-racist lens, there is no justification. Any celebration of one group cannot come at the cost of oppressing another. Just wanted to see your reaction to what she's saying, how you feel.
Because Columbus is recognized as a figure of oppression, that
so I think the point is Columbus is clearly celebrated by some, but it is a symbol of oppression by others, and so that's the question really, whether this attendee is expressing that feeling, that she is Italian American. She feels that we should not use a symbol that feels oppressive to other populations, I think is how she's putting.
Well, I would agree with that, especially in terms of the public monuments. Yeah, right. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, for sure, the issue with the Arrigo Park that I was stressing is that there is a sense of ownership for that statue and what it represented at the time, which is not to say that, it should be erected, again, without there being some sort of examination about what that would mean. So I guess, is it about the holiday, the Christopher Columbus holiday, that it shouldn't be? Okay, well.
I don't have more details. This is what was in the question, so I think we can only interpret the rest.
Yeah, I would say that one thing that William Connell brought out is that as a federal holiday, it would take an act of Congress to overturn it on the federal calendar, which I assume can be done if there is enough support for that to go forward. But I would not expect anyone to celebrate somebody that is an oppressor.
Okay, now so I think you answered the question. I think it was more a comment than was a question, really. So here is another question, and in this particular case come from an American, from someone considering the perspective of Columbus rather than. So here is the full question. It's a long question, so take a breath because it's going to take a while. Well, when a statue is erected in a public place to ostensibly honor a historical figure, does that gesture also honor those that who that honoree represents? That's one question. And then, if so, is the removal of the controversial monument not only a renunciation of putative honorees, but also of those whom they represent? Do those who advocate removal want to dishonor the Italian immigrants and their offspring that have contributed substantially to the vitality, energy, and cultural riches of one of the world's great cities? That's a long question, and clearly from one perspective. I'll read another one from the other perspective in a moment.
Again, it goes back to how we're going to interpret our public monuments. I mean, why were the monuments erected in Chicago? They were erected in commemoration of the Columbian Exposition, which was a celebration of the new Americanness as recognized in 1893. They were one of the statues was adopted, by a particular community because they recognized in it an image of their success story, of their struggles and triumphs and their success story. I mean, that would be the Arrigo Park one. I don't think the other two statues don't have that same sort of legacy to them. Can multiple readings be possible of the same figure? Yes. How can you allow them to coexist in a public space? I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. I can tell you one thing. Down south, there was an example. One of my friends that does public monuments history they tried unsuccessfully to have one of the Confederate monuments taken down, and they were blocked for different reasons. And so there was another plaque put up on the same site, which explained the context in which it was erected, and how it could be looked at as potentially a work of art, but then to recognize also what else it stood for. I mean, having a reminder of where we've been and where we go is not necessarily a bad thing. I think we evolve, hopefully, as a community and go forward.
So, Professor Simonini, I just look at the watch and realize we are getting to the end of this event. And I am going to ask the technical organizers to send you the rest of the questions, because there are many questions. I think you'll find them very interesting, taking different perspectives. And I wish I had more time to ask you, because I'm really happy to see. But I'm going to just close this event. First of all, thank you personally for this discussion on a very complex issue. I think you gave a presentation of perspectives that tell us so much about the ways we look at history, narratives, colonialism, cultural domination, cultural subversion. And to me, your representation remind me that contemporary issues of ethnicity, narrative, and power really do not exist in a vacuum. And that we have to take global and cultural cultures and institutions into account. So Columbus is rightly seen today as a symbol of oppression and racism because of his brutality against the Taino people. But there was a time where the other people were being discriminated, and that was a big point in the lecture, and being persecuted. And the same brutal man against the Taino was a symbol and a shield for their salvation. So to me, a lesson is that history of racism and discrimination is very complex and unfortunately, perhaps deeply human. And so I would hope that this lesson would reach us another conclusion, which is that our dissimilarities are not what divide us. And we are divided by our inability to acknowledge, welcome, and celebrate those differences. And this is what I would call us to try to do in this conversation. I would say also that scholarship like yours, Professor Simonini, is a critical element in understanding the complex issues today. I am thus grateful to you. I'm also grateful to everyone that joined us and gave us support and engagement. Connecting in discussion, reflection in action is our Loyola legacy for over 150 years. And taking part in the conversation with you and with the audience sustain our mission to foster civil discourse, which now it's more important than ever. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to finish by inviting you to join us for our final 150 Scholars event for this academic year. And this will take place on Tuesday, April 27, a week from now. We will then host a panel discussing the exploration of the importance of basic research in the advancement of knowledge and technology. The panel will discuss prominent discoveries arising from basic scientific inquiry, in which the application of research only became apparent after the fact. And this will be led by Professor Graham Moran, the Carl Moore Research Chair in Chemistry and Biochemistry. And the title will be Truth, Basic Research, and the Scientific Method. And I hope that you can join us on April 27. Once again, thank you all for coming, and please stay safe and healthy.